The first thing Maren Voss heard when the proximity alarm screamed to life was her own breathing. Loud, too loud. A wet rasp inside the helmet that she'd been ignoring for 3 hours. Then she heard the second thing, silence from the other side of the ship. Silence where Dahlia's voice was supposed to be. She unclipped her harness and pushed through the connector tunnel at a speed that wasn't quite reckless, pulling herself hand over hand through the zero-G corridor of the ESS Pilgrim, while red emergency light turned everything the color of old blood. The tunnel smelled of recycled air and the faint chemical bite of coolant. Somewhere behind her, in the drive compartment, something groaned. A deep metallic shudder that moved through the hull like a word spoken in a language she didn't have yet. Dahlia. Her voice came out flat. Not a question, no answer. Maren had been a crew commander for 11 years. Before that, a pilot. Before that, the kind of teenager who dismantled household electronics and reassembled them into things they were never meant to be. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for the worst that space could offer. Micrometeorite strikes, decompression events, cascade system failures, the long silent dying of a reactor core. She had never prepared for this because no one had. There was no training module for this. There was no historical precedent that anyone had survived long enough to write down. She had not prepared for war. The corridor opened into the operations bay. Dahlia was there, suited, pressed against the far viewport with both hands braced on the frame. Outside, the stars were wrong. Not their positions, she would have noticed that. Their quality. The light they cast was cold and thin and somehow directional. The way light in a room is directional, which is not how starlight works, which is not how starlight has ever worked in the 4 billion years it has been falling silently on the surface of this solar system. How many, Maren said. I stopped counting at 9. Dahlia didn't turn around. Her voice was even, the voice she used for hard data, for numbers she needed to say out loud before she could believe them. They're not using any emission profile I recognize. Not fusion drives. Not ion. Nothing. They're just moving toward us? No, a pause toward the station. Maren crossed to the viewport and looked. The objects, she refused still to use any other word for them, were elongated and dark and caught the thin light in ways that implied texture, implied surface geometry, without revealing anything specific. They moved in a configuration that was almost but not quite like a formation, as if the concept of formation was something they'd approximated from a description rather than a diagram. The station they were moving toward was ESS Gateway, humanity's most ambitious structure, 4 years in construction, currently home to 612 people. It hung in the viewport at a distance of roughly 40,000 kilometers, visible only because of its running lights, a scatter of small warm points, the yellow-white of tungsten that someone had chosen because it looked like home. Maren keyed her comm. Gateway, this is Pilgrim. Do you have eyes on our bogies? Over. The response came back in fragments. Their comms were degrading already. Static, a voice, more static. She caught, yes, and we see, and recommend, and then the signal dissolved completely and left only a sound like the ocean, like something enormous breathing in a very large space. She stood with the dead comm in her hand for a moment. Then she set it down carefully, the way you set down something you might need again, and turned to Dahlia. Options. Dahlia finally turned around. She was 43 years old. Brown-skinned, with a scar along her jawline from a rock-climbing accident in her 20s that she'd never had fixed because, she said, it reminded her that she'd survived the fall. Her expression right now was the one Maren had seen twice before, in 11 years, the expression she made when the math was finished and the math was bad. We run, Dahlia said. We have enough fuel to slingshot around Jupiter, slow ourselves in the outer belt. Wait it out. Wait what out, whatever this is. Maren looked back out the viewport. One of the objects had changed direction. It was hard to tell from this distance. The light was deceptive. The scale was deceptive. But she was certain. She had the spatial awareness of someone who had spent 20 years reading the movement of objects in three-dimensional space by the way their relative position shifted against fixed reference points, and she was certain. It turned, she said. I know. To look at us? Dahlia was quiet for a moment. I don't know what it's doing. I don't know anything about what it's doing. I've been watching for 40 minutes, and I don't understand one single thing I'm looking at. I understand the math, and I understand the physics, and beyond that, I've got nothing. Maren thought of something her father had told her when she was 9, the summer she found the wasp nest in the wall of the garden shed and decided to poke it with a stick to see what would happen. You want to understand things, he'd said, pulling wasps off her forearm with patient hands. That's a good thing. But understanding a thing and surviving a thing are two different problems, and you need to be clear on which one you're solving. Okay, she said. We're not running, Marin. We're not running. She pulled herself to the navigation console and began pulling up the Pilgrim Systems inventory with both hands, switching between screens with the automatic fluency of long practice. Running gets us 80 million kilometers from here in 12 days. If those things can cross interstellar space, 12 days is nothing. Running is just dying tired. So we're not doing that. She paused, staring at a readout. What we're going to do is think. Dahlia was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, what are we thinking about? About the fact that they haven't fired yet. Marin turned around. Whatever weapons they have, and they have weapons, something punched a hole through the Callisto relay station 3 hours ago, and I don't think it was a rock. They haven't used them on us. Why? We're a small ship. Maybe not worth the, or maybe they're watching us. She moved to the secondary ops station, the one they used for communications analysis. Same reason you watch a new animal in an unfamiliar ecosystem. Before you decide what it is, she began to work. Her hands moved without conscious direction, while the thinking part of her stood behind her eyes and assembled the problem piece by piece. Here is what she knew. 9 objects, possibly more. Unknown propulsion, unknown weapons, but weaponly, gateway in their path. 612 people in those lights. Her comms down. Dahlia's comms down. 12 days to run, and nowhere that was actually far enough. Here is what she didn't know. Everything else. In situations of profound uncertainty, Marin had learned, the useful question was not what do I know, but what can I infer? You worked from the observable to the probable. You built a model that was almost certainly wrong. Then you used it anyway, because a wrong model updated toward correct was better than paralysis. Observable. The objects moved in near formation but not formation, the approximation of organization without the precision. Probable inference, collective but not commanded, coordinated but not hierarchical. Observable, they had changed direction when the Pilgrim powered its comms, not when it moved, when it transmitted. Probable inference, they were sensitive to signal, to communication specifically. Observable, they had destroyed a relay station, a transmitter, but not the station crew, who had evacuated to a secondary habitat and were, as of 3 hours ago, still alive. Probable inference, the targets were the transmitters, not the transmitters' operators. Marin stopped typing. They're jamming us, she said slowly. We know they're. No, I mean that's the goal. Not destruction. Silence. They're trying to make us quiet. Dahlia crossed the bay to her side, read the screen, said nothing for a long moment. That's not nothing, she said finally. No, it's information. Marin rubbed her eyes under the helmet's HUD. She was tired. She had been awake for 19 hours, and the quality of her thinking was starting to degrade in the small ways that she could only notice by comparison to how she usually thought. She needed to stay ahead of that. Beings that want you dead and gone don't care if you're quiet. They just make you dead and gone. Beings that want you quiet have a reason to want you quiet, which means silence means something to them, which means communication means something to them, which means she stopped, stared at the screen. A thought was forming that was either very good or very stupid, and she couldn't yet tell which. They came here because they heard us. Dahlia turned to look at her directly. Say that again. The probe signals, the deep space transmissions, all of it, for 100 years, we've been broadcasting into the dark. They heard us. They came. And now they want us to stop. She looked up. What does that tell you about what our signals sound like to them? Silence. Outside, the lights of Gateway glittered. Somewhere behind them, moving on trajectories she couldn't yet calculate, 9 objects that weren't. Ships arranged themselves in patterns she didn't understand, Dahlia said, like an alarm, or a weapon, or something in between. Marin pushed back from the console. Either way, they're not here to exterminate. They're here to... The hull hit them. That was the only way to describe it. Something struck the hull of the Pilgrim like an enormous flat palm, a concussion that moved through the frame and through the deck plating and through the soles of Marin's boots and up into her spine. And for 3 seconds, every system on the board went white, and then they came back online one by one like lights being switched on in a dark house. And the Pilgrim was still whole, and Marin was still breathing, and Dahlia was at the far end of the bay on her hands and knees, pulling herself upright. Status, Marin said. Her own voice sounded distant to her. Hull integrity. Dahlia pulled herself to the damage board. We've got. Hull integrity is fine. We've got a sensor cluster down on the port side. Port comm array is gone. She looked up. They hit us and didn't break us. Warning shot. Or a demonstration. Marin thought about that. A demonstration. Something powerful enough to kill them, showing them instead that it could kill them, and then choosing not to. That was a message. That was in its way a very complex message. It implied, assumed, that she could receive it. They think we're intelligent, she said. At minimum, they're behaving as if we might be. How does that help us? It's the only thing that helps us. She was moving again back to the communication station, pulling up the frequency analyzer. If they think we're intelligent, then they think we can be communicated with, which means there's a version of this where we talk our way out. Talk. Dahlia's voice was flat. With what? Our comms are. Our comms are what they don't want us using, because they sound like whatever they sound like to them. An alarm, a weapon, I don't know. Marin was scrolling through the frequency logs, looking for the emissions profile from the objects. But they've been broadcasting too. However they coordinate with each other, there's a signal. There's always a signal. She found it, stared at it. There. It was unlike anything in the database. Of course it was. It occupied a frequency range that no human equipment had ever deliberately used for communication. Not radio, not microwave, not the tightly focused laser comm that newer ships were starting to use. It was in the infrared to visible light transition range, in the near-infrared specifically, and it was structured. She could see the structure, the non-random repetition, the patterns within patterns that were the universal fingerprint of meaning-making, rather than noise. It was, Marin realized, beautiful. Whatever it meant, the signal itself had a quality that she could only describe as deliberate beauty. The patterns were too elegant for pure function. They reminded her of mathematics, of the way a proof could be not just correct, but clean. They're not just coordinating, she said. They're talking, in something that's closer to music than to language. Dahlia read over her shoulder. Or it looks like music to us, because it isn't like language to us. Yes, exactly. Marin sat very still for a moment. The thought arrived whole, the way good thoughts did, not built piece by piece, but suddenly present, as if it had been waiting. That's exactly it. It doesn't look like language to us. So our signals don't look like language to them. They look like something else. Something they react to the way we'd react to a very loud noise in a library. So we have to stop making the loud noise. We have to stop making the loud noise. She paused. And then we have to make a different noise. One that sounds like what they use. Dahlia stared at her for a long moment. Her face had the particular stillness of a person recalculating. You want to talk to them, she said, in infrared. I want to try. Yes, with equipment that's designed for solar observation and thermal imaging. It's what we have. Dahlia looked out the viewport. The objects were holding their position, no closer, no further. Waiting. Marin, I need to say something. Say it. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and I have been on 6 deep space missions with you, and the bar is very high. Marin almost smiled. I know, and I'm going to help you do it anyway. I know that too. They worked for 2 hours. The Pilgrim's solar observation array was bolted to the exterior of the hull and controlled through a dedicated subsystem. It was not in any sense a communication device. What it was, in a technical sense, was a precision-controlled source of near-infrared radiation with a very narrow beam angle and very fine modulation control. Marin had used it, in her previous life, as a researcher before Command pulled her sideways to measure atmospheric absorption profiles in the outer solar system. She had never used it to speak. She was going to speak now. The problem was content. She could modulate the signal. She could structure it. But structure required something to structure. And what do you say to something that crossed interstellar space and arrived angry because your civilization was too loud? You say what you are, what you want, what you're offering. Marin thought about this carefully. She thought about the basics, mathematical constants, prime sequences, geometric relationships. The oldest idea in the book. The idea that mathematics was the universal language. The one thing any sufficiently complex intelligence would share, because mathematics wasn't invented. It was discovered. 2 plus 2 was 4 at the edge of the universe. A circle's circumference was pi times its diameter around every star in every galaxy. That was not nothing, that was a handhold. She thought about the structure of their own signal, the music-like quality, the layers of meaning nested inside each other. She modeled it, roughly, using the frequency analyzer. Then she built a response that borrowed its architecture, a mathematical foundation, prime sequences, Fibonacci, the first 10 digits of pi, structured inside a carrier pattern that approximated the layered quality of their communication. She made it quiet, careful. She made it, she hoped, she could not know. Small. Here I am small, I am not threatening, I am trying. Ready, she said. If they hit us again, Dahlia said, they might not stop at a demonstration. I know. Okay. Dahlia pulled up the damage control console. I'll have both hands on the emergency venting system. If the hull goes, I can. Don't think about the hull going. I'm always thinking about the hull going. It's literally my job, Marin transmitted. The silence that followed was 37 seconds long. She counted them. She had the countdown running on her HUD, and she watched the numbers. And in the space between the numbers, she was aware of everything. The recycled taste of the air, the small sounds of the ship's systems, Dahlia's breathing 6 feet behind her, the distant glitter of Gateway's lights, the immensity of the dark around them. She was aware of the fact that she was a human being, a specifically human being, with a specific history and a specific set of scars and a specific laugh that came out slightly wrong when she was tired. And that somewhere outside the thin shell of this ship there were things that had no word for any of that, that had no framework in which her humanity was even a category. And she had just tried to say hello. The response came back at 37 seconds, and she stopped counting. It arrived in the near-infrared, in a structure that used her architecture as a scaffold and built something new on top of it. The mathematical foundation was there. She could see her own primes reflected back, transformed, elaborated. But the transformation added layers she hadn't put in. The pattern wasn't just confirming receipt of a signal. It was responding to the content. It was telling her something back. Are you reading this? She said. Dahlia had appeared beside her. Yes. Can you decode it? Working. Dahlia's hands moved fast and precise. It confirms the mathematical constants. It's adding, I don't know, it's adding something positional. Coordinates? Not in our notation, but a location. I think so. I think it's saying here, I'm here or we're here, something that means presence. Marin exhaled long and slow. Here I am back to you. Here. Presence. I'm answering. They understood. Or something understood. Something that heard us using our model and answered in our model. Dahlia straightened. Which is, I don't want to call it good news until I know more. It's not good news, Marin agreed. It's just less bad news. That's all we're working toward right now. Less bad, she transmitted again. This time she tried something more complex, the mathematical constants, then a pattern representing motion, approaching and retreating, the difference between the two, and then a question, a signal theory question, the simplest one possible, a pulse with a gap waiting to be filled. What comes next? The response took 49 seconds. When it came, it was longer and denser than the previous one. Dahlia worked on it for 3 minutes while Marin watched the objects outside and kept her hands on the modulation controls and tried not to think too hard about Gateway and its 612 lights. Okay, Dahlia said. Okay, I think I have something. The motion pattern you sent, the approach and retreat, they're responding to the approach portion, emphasizing it. And then there's a new element, something I haven't seen in their previous transmissions, that I think is a temporal marker. A when. They want us to approach something, or they're going to approach us, or both. But it's a when. There's a time component. Marin looked at the object that had shifted direction earlier, the one she thought had turned to look at them. It was closer now. Not threateningly closer, not on an intercept trajectory. But not holding station anymore either. Moving deliberately toward a point in space roughly between the Pilgrim's position and Gateway's. A meeting point. She felt something she didn't have a name for. It wasn't relief. It was far too early for relief, and relief would probably get her killed. It wasn't hope, exactly. Too specific. It was something more like the feeling of a very long equation, resolving to something that wasn't zero. Not the answer. Just the knowledge that the answer existed. That the problem was, in principle, solvable. I'm going to need you to fly, she said. Dahlia looked at her. You're going to keep transmitting. Someone has to keep transmitting, and someone has to fly, and you're a better pilot than I am. I'm a much better pilot than you are, Dahlia said, with a calmness that, in the current circumstances, was one of the most remarkable things Marin had ever heard. She moved to the flight controls and began the calculation for the approach vector without further discussion, with the same efficient focus she brought to every problem. Because this was who Dahlia was, the person who, once the decision was made, committed to the execution completely, holding the fear out of the way with both hands until there was time for it. They flew toward the meeting point. The object, the one that had turned to look at them, grew slowly from a smear of reflected light to a shape. Marin had been bracing for something terrible and alien, and the thing was terrible and alien and also, somehow, more ordinary than she'd imagined. It was large, roughly the size of a football pitch, she thought, though the scale kept slipping as her brain tried and failed to find a reference frame. Its surface was not smooth. It was textured, layered, with structure that looked almost geological, like something that had grown rather than been built. And it was dark. Not the flat, dead darkness of unpainted metal, but a darkness that moved subtly, the way the pupil of an eye is dark and yet alive. She kept transmitting. The exchange had found a rhythm now. She sent. They waited. The response arrived. She and Dahlia decoded. She incorporated what they'd told her into the next message. It was slow. It was imprecise. It was, by any reasonable measure, a completely inadequate tool for the situation. It was working. She learned. They were not one entity, but many. The objects were not ships in the way she understood ships. They were not separate craft. They were more like cells. Something larger and distributed that moved through space as a collective, in the way that some organisms moved as colonies, coordinated, connected, individual, and plural simultaneously. She learned. The signals they'd destroyed were painful to them, not metaphorically. The frequencies that human communications happened to use intersected with whatever sense they used to navigate, to speak, to be. 100 years of human broadcasting had been, from their perspective, like a loud and constant scream. And they had come, not to destroy, not to conquer, but in the way that a person walks toward the source of a noise that's been hurting them for a very long time, reaching out to say, please stop, not knowing if the thing that was screaming on purpose. She learned. They had been afraid of humanity, of the sheer volume of the transmissions, of what something that screamed that loud without stopping might be capable of. Marin sat with that for a moment. She sat with the image of humanity as seen from the outside, a small blue planet shouting into the dark with all the cheerful obliviousness of a species that had only just learned to make noise and was delighted by the sound of its own voice, utterly unaware of what it was drowning out, whose conversation it was interrupting, whose equivalent of sleep it was keeping. And she felt, sharply and briefly, embarrassed. Then she felt something else. Pride, maybe. The complicated kind, because they'd come. Whatever fear they had, however loud humanity was, however alarming, they had not opened fire from a distance and then left. They had come close. They had struck a demonstration blow, and then they had stopped. They had waited. They had hoped for response. She thought about transmitting that. The concept of also being afraid. She worked on it for a few minutes, trying to find a structure in the mathematical signal language that could carry it. And finally she sent something that was probably wrong, but was the best she could do. The pattern for presence, paired with the motion pattern for retreat, not approach, and a repetition of their initial transmission back at them. Here I am, small, not threatening, but this time with the temporal marker that she thought meant when. When they had first arrived, before she'd answered, here is what I was, before, here is what I've been since. The response took longer this time, 4 minutes. Marin watched Dahlia hold the pilgrim at a careful station-keeping distance from the object, making tiny adjustments with a light touch on the controls, the focused patience of someone doing close-quarters ship handling, in a situation where close-quarters ship handling had never been done before, in circumstances that no manual had ever addressed, with a calmness that was not the absence of fear but its management, channeled into the motor control, the eye-hand precision, the continuous, gentle corrections that kept them alive. They were not here by accident, Marin thought, not just her and Dahlia specifically, but humans, here, in this moment, a species that had evolved in an environment where misreading another being's intentions got you eaten, and where reading them correctly got you alliances, trade, the gradual and improbable expansion of who counted as ours. A species that had spent its entire existence learning the nearly impossible skill of understanding something different from itself well enough to coexist with it. Badly, often, violently, sometimes. But learning, still learning, always, the way only something that could imagine its own extinction could be motivated to learn. That was the human thing. Not strength, not weapons. The learning. The response came back. Dahlia read it first and then looked up with an expression that Marin couldn't quite interpret. What? Marin said. I think. Dahlia paused, started again. I think they're asking us to come closer. Marin looked at the object. At its living darkness, its geological surface, the way it held its position with something that was, she now knew, effort. Not passive, floating, but active, deliberate stillness. A held breath. How much closer, she said. All the way, Dahlia said. I think they want us to come alongside. Outside, Gateway's lights burned yellow-white, warm as home. 612 people waiting in the dark. Behind Marin, the ship's systems ran their quiet, continuous hum. Ahead, large and close and utterly unknown. A thing that had crossed the distance between stars because humans were too loud, and it had decided, against all reason and experience, to come and ask them to please be quieter rather than simply making them stop. It had decided to try. Marin thought of her father, his patient hands pulling wasps from her arm. Understanding a thing and surviving a thing are two different problems. She'd spent her career solving the second one. Today, finally, she was getting to solve the first. Take us in, she said. Dahlia took them in. They came alongside at less than 200 meters. Close enough that the object filled the entire forward viewport. Close enough that the surface details resolved into something that she still didn't have language for, but was trying to find. The darkness moved. The texture breathed. Something that was not a light, but occupied the same cognitive space as a light pulsed once, deep in the structure, and she thought, they see us. Not with eyes, but with whatever they have. They see us right now. She transmitted one more time. No mathematics this time. No structural formalism. Just the near-infrared modulated in the simplest possible pattern. The one that, in the first 49-second wait, she had noticed the response contained but never repeated, as if they'd held it in reserve. The pattern that she had tentatively, cautiously, labeled in her notes simply as, hello. The response came back immediately. Not 49 seconds, not 4 minutes, immediately. The same pattern doubled, then tripled, then a cascade of it. Repeated variations, the same hello reflected and elaborated, and sent back to her as if they had been waiting for permission to say it, and now they were saying it all at once, saying it in every wavelength she'd used and some she hadn't. Saying it in the near-infrared light that fell warm and invisible and full of meaning on the forward viewport of the SS Pilgrim, where two human beings floated in recycled air and stale light and the accumulated weight of everything their species had ever built, and heard, for the first time in all of human history, the universe say something back. Marin closed her eyes. Just for a moment, the ship hummed. Dahlia was quiet. Through the hull, she could feel, very faintly, the vibration of the other craft. The colony, the collective, whatever the right word was for something that had no word, adjusting its position incrementally, the way two people shift to face each other more directly when the conversation matters. She thought of a word she'd read once, in a book she'd found in her father's study at the age of 12. When she was going through his shelves looking for something to take apart, she'd opened it by accident and read one page and put it back and never told him. The word was sonder. The realization that each passerby has a life as vivid and complex as one's own. She thought humanity had about 6 months, maybe a year, before someone panicked and launched something. 6 months, maybe a year, to build something better than that. 6 months, maybe a year, in which two small women in a second-hand research ship, using equipment designed for looking at the sun, had somehow become the most important diplomats in human history. Not because they were the best suited for it, but because they were there. And they were awake, and they had decided to try thinking before shooting. She opened her eyes. Okay, she said. I need more paper. Metaphorically. I need to figure out how to say, we would like to talk to someone with authority. Dahlia made a sound that was almost a laugh. You can't delegate this. I know. That's not what I mean. I mean, she gestured at the viewport, at the signal logs. At the 11 hours of improvised first-contact linguistics they had accumulated in a situation where improvised first-contact linguistics was all that stood between Gateway and 612 funerals. I mean, we need to make this official. We need to make this last. We need to bring other people into it before we do something irreversible, or fail to do something irreversible that we should have done. Or before we're the only two people who know how to do this and something happens to us. Yes, that. Dahlia thought for a moment. The short-range localized comms would still work, below the threshold of what they're suppressing. If we could get a relay. The emergency buoy. Marin was already moving. The emergency buoy runs at 2.4 gigahertz. That's way below anything they've targeted. We launch it toward Gateway. It carries our signal logs and our translation framework and our notes, and Gateway figures out what to do with that from there. That's a plan, Dahlia said. That's actually a plan. They launched the buoy 10 minutes later. It drifted away from the Pilgrim on a slow curve toward Gateway, small and patient, carrying in its memory banks 11 hours of human creativity and stubbornness and fear, and the accumulated knowledge of a species that was very loud and very young, and had today, in this specific hour, in this specific way, proved that it was also sometimes capable of being something else. Marin watched it go. Outside, the collective. She was going to use that word, until she found a better one. Pulsed once with something that might have been acknowledgement. She couldn't know. She was working from a translation framework she'd built in 11 hours under severe duress, using equipment designed for something else entirely. She was almost certainly wrong about large portions of it. She was going to keep refining it for the rest of her life, and she still might never get it right. And that was okay. That was the work. She transmitted one last time before the buoy was out of range. She sent the pattern for presence. She sent the temporal marker that meant now. She sent the mathematical constant that she had by this point come to think of as the word for both of them at once, a shared thing, a thing held in common. The number that was the same whether you had hands or not, whether you breathed air or not, whether you had grown up on a small blue planet or crossed a darkness that she could not even correctly imagine. She sent pi. The response came back warm and immediate, and she didn't try to decode all of it because she didn't have to. She knew the shape of it now. She knew what it meant to be answered. Dahlia said nothing. She was looking at the viewport, at the surface of the collective, at the way the living dark moved and breathed. Her expression was the one Marin had seen once before, and only once. The morning they had emerged from behind Jupiter on the Pilgrim's first deep space run, and the full breadth of the outer solar system had opened up in front of them, and both of them had just stopped and stared. Not fear, not triumph, something quieter than either. The understanding that you were very small and very far from home and the universe was larger than you'd imagined, and that this was not a problem, that this was the whole point.